Welcome back to Cinema Geek in this new series about the color page inside of DaVinci Resolve 18. Now, once again, this tutorial and every tutorial following in the series, the source material that we're using to work with comes directly from the Blackmagic design page and their training inside of DaVinci Resolve. You can find everything in the description. So you can just download all the different source materials and all the files and then work alongside these lessons. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk before we get started is that this series is targeted to beginners. So if you think that you know a lot of the stuff that we're going to be covering, obviously you can skip sections or even entire lessons. And if you're more advanced, you can jump to, say, the lesson 4 or 5, depending on what your skill and level of experience is. So that's also another thing that I wanted to talk about before we get started. Now, I'm here in the color page and let's get started right away. And let's just jump into it. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is obviously I'm in the color page because, as I said in a previous series, whatever you were working on inside of Resolve, it opens up on your next project to that specific page. So in this case, I was coloring some stuff and that's what it opens. So now I shouldn't say coloring, by the way, before we start the series. I was grading, okay, some files and some clips. Anyway, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to discuss now, before we talk about actual grading, it's we can always come here, right? And you can see all the different panels. If you right click here, you can say show icons only. If the text is bothering you, by the way, and you want a little bit more space, you can right click and show icons only, or you can show it with a label. So it's really up to you. But that's one quick tip there to even maximize a little bit more of your space if you need. And you can see that everything, by the way, gets resized dynamically, just like everything in Resolve. Okay, great. So let's get started. The first thing I'm gonna make sure of before we start, it's always go on my workspace here, and we are going to go on Reset UI Layout. This is very important because say you made a change or something and you didn't resize it properly, or I don't know, something just it's not working for you, you can do that. It takes you back to your default layout. Great. The next thing I want to discuss is how do we back up, and how, especially when you grade and edit as well, but it's the fact that every change you make, right, can within even a minute or 2 minutes, there is a lot happening. So you always want to make sure that you have backups and you're really constantly saving and have everything available to you. So in case that the computer crashes, not much the case with Resolve. In fact, it never crashes for me. It only happened just a few times in years, which is absolutely insane. But all right, so let's do that. I'm going to come here on my DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to go on Preferences, and then here you can see that we have all the different panels here. I'm going to come here on User, and then I am going to go on Project Save here and Load. And you can see that the Live Save feature inside of Save Settings is already checked. And there is also another feature here, which is the Project Backups. And that's what I mean by let's have some backups and let's back up our project. Now, if I click on it, you can see that now this checkbox here, we have all these options available for us. One of them is perform backups every 10 minutes. So that's basically very self-explanatory. Every 10 minutes, there is a backup, okay? File, those are files, actual files, that you can go back and reload it, okay? So you have every 10 minutes, now you have a backup. Then you have also the hourly backup for the past 2 hours. So it's 2 hourly backups for the past 2, okay? So hourly backups for the past 2 hours. You can change that also if you want it to be 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever. I'll keep it to the default settings here. And then you have the daily backups for the past 2 days. Now, you might wonder, why is this important? Well, it's important because say you worked on a project where you made a lot of changes the past 2 days. However, you want to go back to that specific save you had a day and a half ago because you remember there was something about it that, oh, I had something there that maybe just I want to go back and see what I did. And you have that available. So that's why I say having backups is so important, because you don't lose those files. So it's there and you can always find it. All you got to do is just select. You can customize as you wish, and then just find your backup location. So in this case, it could be on your computer, it could be on your hard drive. That's all up to you and the way you like to work. But this is really, really important, and I would highly suggest you to make use of it. So I'm going to uncheck that because for this tutorial we don't need it, but it's right there. Okay, so it's on your project settings. Great. So now let's finally talk about the color layout here and everything that, well, in broad strokes, we're going to basically describe all the different pages, what they do. If you're an experienced editor, I think you can even skip this part, but it's always good to, reiteration and going back, it's always good. But if you're someone that just started, you're a beginner, and you're looking at this, you are probably very overwhelmed by what is this? What is going on here? The crazy part about the color page is actually very, very simple once you understand what those tools do. Like everything in life, really, but it's extremely simple. It's not that complicated. So let's start from the top. Here we have a gallery. You can see it here, a gallery. And now it says no stills created. The gallery is where you would obviously have image, so references, high quality references from the internet or from shot deck, something like that, if you're color grading and matching a shot right from a movie. So you would have that. You can apply grades and then they save here right in the gallery. And so it's basically they're all collected here. And this will all make sense as we progress with our tutorials. It's very, very self-explanatory. Then you have our viewer here, which is obviously the visual representation of the clip that we've selected. And obviously this is, at this point, you can also move the scrubber right underneath here and play back your clip. Nothing much to say there. Then you have the node editor, which is basically where most of the magic happens. And you can add nodes, you can add resolve effects. We will explain all of this very, very shortly. So that's there. Then here you can see you have your thumbnail timeline, and you can click on each thumbnail to quickly jump between clips. Now you can see that this is very, very linked to right underneath. You have the mini timeline, so they're correlated to each other in the sense that you can also click on the mini timeline. This resembles a bit more the edit page in the sense that you can see this track, V1 track, and all the different clips in our timeline here. So that's the mini timeline there. And what do they do? Basically, you can move through your clips faster. Oftentimes, a lot of colorists that I know, they usually the timeline or the clips, depending on which, how big your project is, but the timeline, I always see it. Most of my colorist friends, it's never there, but it's here by default, so you could see it. It's right there. And other than that, then you have your primaries color wheels here. The primaries color wheels, you can see here, we are going to talk about this in just a few minutes and go in detail about it, but it's right here. Then you have your curves in the center here. Then you have your keyframes here. Now, quick thing about the bottom part, you have different palettes here. So you could see here, you have your left palette, you have your middle or central palette here, and then you have your right palette. Now, every palette, you can go through all the different tools available to you. So let me show you. Here you have your camera raw. Here you have your color match. Here you have your primary color wheels. Here you have your high dynamic range or HDR color wheels. Here you have your RGB mixer, and then finally the motion effects. So you can just quickly go through them here. We will be obviously going through everything as we progress through the series. So all of that will make sense. So don't be intimidated by all those different options. And then you have the central palette here, which by default you have the curves, as you can see here. Then you have your color warper. You have your qualifier, HSL. then your window, your tracker, magic mask, blur, key, sizing input, and then 3D. And then on the right panel over here, you have your keyframes, which it's useful, but most people would go here on your scopes, and then you have information about the clip in case. I never use this. Do I? No, I never use this. It's crazy. And then your scopes, and as I said, the keyframes. Okay, so that's your general layout. That's your general layout. So now, let's talk about the viewer. So, as I said, self-explanatory. Whatever click you select, you have your playback here. Now you can obviously, here you have your transport controls. As you can see, you can play and you can stop. Alternatively, you have all the different options, by the way, all across Resolve. The transport, that's pretty universal across each page. Obviously, you have your previous clip and play reverse, stop, play, right? Next clip and loop. That's there. Now, what's important here that you have also these three options here, the color page, which are the image wipe, the split screen, and the highlight. Now, the image wipe, which is something that I use constantly, I mean, literally all the time. It's very, very useful, and a lot of colorists use it a lot. So the image wipe, what it does is, say you have one of the movies I love, Blade Runner, right? You go on shot deck, you get a shot from Blade Runner, right? You have your image reference, and then you load it here into your gallery. Then with the image wipe, what you can do is your currently selected clip, and then you take your reference photo, and then with the wipe, you can wipe between them, right? And see, they're basically, you're matching them, or, you know, it's all here in the viewer. And then you can click on it. Then by clicking on it, by the way, you can select to wipe it horizontally, vertically, diagonally. So you have all these different options. All of this will make sense in the upcoming lessons, so do not worry. Then here you have also your split screen, which I also use a lot, and the highlight, which I use all the time. So the highlight basically brings up a matte. So you have selected a clip, and then you bring up a matte, say you're using a qualifier, right? And then you want to extract specific portions of your image. Great. And that's that with the viewer. Then one last thing, you also have here some other options to select, obviously, a qualifier, power window, image window, dust removal, open effects, and color chart. It's also here as well. So that's very cool. And then one thing that we need to also understand is that obviously each of our section here also has the three dot button that basically brings up different options about each section or each panel here, right? So there you have it across all the different pages, right? All the different panels here. And then, yeah, so that's very useful. Then let's talk about the color wheels finally here, the primary color wheels. So the color wheels, you can see here, this can be a little bit overwhelming maybe if this is your first time on Resolve, but for most people, it's not really. So you can see you have your lift, gamma, gain, and offset. Now, so each of these, right, affect different parts of your image. So different luminance ranges and hue ranges as well. So now the lift affects your shadows. The gamma affects your midtones. The gain affects your highlights in your image. And the offset affects the image uniformly. Okay, so the luminance and hue as well, uniformly. So what does that mean? That means that, so if I'm going to change the highlights of my image, I want to either change the hue or the luminance, right? I can do that to that specific tonal range. So the lift here, it's going to affect the shadows. So I can change the hue inside of shadows here. You can see that. And with the master wheel, these, by the way, underneath, these are the master wheels. So with these, you can affect the luminance within your specific tonal range. So I'm going to affect, right? I want to either brighten it or make it darker. So I'm darkening or making brighter my lift, which is my shadows. I can do the same with my gamma, which is my midtone. And I can do the same with my gain, make it brighter or darker. And offset is going to affect your image uniformly, so as a whole. Now, each of these panels, each tonal range here, each luminance range, you can see, has a reset button. So you can reset it very quickly by clicking on each over here. And you can see that resets it all. But say I did this, I did something like that, which looks not very good. And you don't want to always reset each specific, right? The lift and the gamma and the gain. You can also come up here and then say reset all, and that takes you back to your starting point. Just as simple as that. So once again, the lift affects your shadows, the gamma affects your midtones, and the gain affects your highlights, with the offset affecting everything. You can change their hue individually or as a whole in the offset, or you can change with the master wheels. Here, you can make them brighter or darker depending on which luminance range you're selecting, or you can just basically, the offset works as an overall exposure because this is affecting the whole image uniformly. So you can come here and then play with that as well. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to say reset all, and I hope this makes sense. It will make a lot of sense, as in a few minutes we'll do an exercise, and it's very easy. Great. So this, understanding this, it's of major importance. It's the primary. That's why it's the primary color wheel. This and the curves. So the color wheels and the curves are the staple of really color correction, color grading. You got to know these things. So that's about that with the color wheels. And obviously you also have temperature, tint, contrast, pivot, so other options available to you. They're all here. Great. And then finally here you have also our scopes, which we'll be talking about in our next exercise, which is right now actually. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to come on my clip number 2 here. So this is our clip. Now you can resize, right, the image, the size of your viewer here by clicking option F. So you can see if you're grading and you want your viewer to be bigger because you want to see what you're doing, you can click option F to do that. Alternatively, you can close some of this panel. So I can close the timeline here panel. I can close my gallery, right? So I can see a little bit better. So in this case, let me keep it like this so you could see a little better. And you can also close your clips. So that also makes a huge difference. But for now, I'm going to keep it like this. And actually, let me take the timeline back so you're a little bit more used to what the default looks like. So we're here on our image. Now, let's talk about the steps that we're going to cover in this lesson. This lesson, it's about balancing. So we're going to balance our image. Now, in the process of balancing, right, we got to normalize an image and then balance it. And these are steps that are so essential when you start a grade, because before you even start grading an image, it's very good, or at least I should say essential actually, to have a clear idea of what your process is going to be. And that's generally depends on the genre that you're working with, depends on the emotional impact that you're trying to so what I'm saying, if it's a commercial, if it's a movie, there is 2 different ways of grading an image. However, the basics, so say normalizing and balancing, that's pretty universal because you want to do those steps first, right? Get your image to a good starting point and then later on, right, grade it and do all the different creative things that everybody loves, by the way. So let's get started with this. So before we start correcting anything, you can't just arbitrarily come here and start dragging things and brightening and darkening. That's not the way to go about it. So let me reset the image here. You want to understand, or at least have the scopes help you read what is that exactly you're doing. And that's a very accurate way. Even if you don't have a calibrated monitor, it's an accurate way to work because it allows you to really see with the science if what you're doing, if you're pushing it too far, if you're clipping your highlights or losing detail in your blacks. So that's why scopes are really essential. Now, it's not good to depend on scopes too much, in the sense that when you're working creatively, of course, you want to be creative and you want to have, right? At the end of the day, this is art. But having, especially in those first few stages, the few steps when you're normalizing and balancing, it's very important to understand how scopes work and how to read them. So let's get started. Here on the parade, I'm going to have the waveform. And let's talk about the waveform and how it works very, very quickly. You can see you have a vertical, right? This vertical side here that goes from 0 to 1023, and then you have the horizontal side. So let's start with the vertical. 0 stands for your blackest point. So this is like black. 0 is black, and 1023 is pure white. Okay, in your graph, you can see it here. And obviously this represents your shadows and this represents your highlights. Everything in the middle, in between, that's your midtones. Okay, good. Up to there, we're good. Now, what you want to do, or at least what you're trying to achieve, is to have contrast, but have an image that roughly starts in between, when it comes to the shadows, in between 0 and 128. So somewhere around here, right? For our shadows, and then bring the highlights back up to, I would say, 90% white. So 896. So nothing going over this bar over here. Now, there is cases, obviously, where you have either specular highlights or specific, but generally speaking, this is generally speaking, you want to keep your image, you don't want to overlap the 896. And that's a little bit how that works. Now, obviously, you can see that we also have the horizontal side here. This basically represents our image. And you can see that how our image, right, learning how to read the scope is very important, because it allows you to very quickly see also what you might need to adjust, not just creatively here, but also scientifically. So, for instance, how do we read the image? We read it from left to right. And that's our image, of course. You can see that there is 3 black points here, or at least darker in our shadows here. And where are those represented? Well, you can see in our image you have 1, 2, and 3, which basically in our trace, this is called a trace, right? It's representing that these are darker pixels as represented in our viewer here. So they go at a lower range in our around between 128 to 0, right? So that's our shadows here. And then you can see that maybe there is brighter parts like the finger here and etc. So you can see those represented also in our trace. So that's how you read it, from left to right, and then the brightness or luminance values goes from vertically, right? Up and down. So you could see that as well. Now, with that said, now let's get started and let's start normalizing our image, which means let's get into the range that we just discussed. To do that, now here in our graph, you can see that we have the RGB channel. So we have all of our colors. We have our red, our green, our blue, and then you can also see that there is a white. What does the white mean? So the white in the trace, that means that the channels have the same intensity. So ideally, if you're balancing an image, right, and you want to get those as close as possible, but you also have to look at the context. If you're balancing an image that has grass, obviously you want the green. The green is not going to be exactly the same with the other colors. Or if you're doing a blue sky, of course, the blue is going to be a little more prominent. But generally speaking, where you have gray areas or white areas or black areas, these you want to have them balanced. So have them have the same intensity. So you would see a white trace. Okay, hope that makes sense. So let's now change this. So here, I'm going to go here on my options, on my settings, sorry. And from RGB here, which obviously is showing our channels, RGB, red, green, and blue channels, I'm going to change to Y. Y represents your luminance. And here on Colorize, I'm going to uncheck that. So you can see that now everything is white and black. And then you also have the option to gradulate or waveform. I'm going to make it a little bit brighter because I want to see better. So I'm going to slide all the way to the right here, my waveform, so I can see a very, very nice, okay, very, very nice representation in our waveform scope here. Perfect. Now let's start normalizing. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shadows in my image here a little bit down, as we discussed earlier. Now you want them ideally between 128 to 0, but I find that as long as you're above this first, in between 0 and this bar here, if you're above that, you're still okay. You're still going to do it. So it also depends on how much you push and pull, but generally speaking, you want to put it to a good starting point. So I'm going to take now the lift, which is our shadows, and I am going to drag that down a bit. So you don't want, see, now you're clipping, you're losing detail. See, you went too far. So you want it to a point where you are in between. So something like that. Something like that works. And then the second thing I'm going to do now is to bring up the highlights. Now, we don't have a reference here where our highlights should be, but we do have this thumb here of this person. So generally speaking, skin tone highlights should be between 55% to around 75%, right, in our waveform. So I'm going to take this up. I'm not going to go to 90% because that's truly overexposing our highlights in this specific case. I'm going to keep it to no more than about 75% of the image. So to this 768, right, range here. So I'm going to take it just a tiny bit up to about here should work. And then the shortcut Command D, you can disable or enable the node. Alternatively, you can click here. So let me show you. So Command D, before, after, or you can click the number here, you can see, and that also works exactly the same way. I'm going to make it full screen, Command F, and then I'm going to show you bypass it again with Command D, before and after. And you can see that we added a little bit of contrast in our image. Great. Now that we worked on our shadows and our highlights with the lift and the gain, let's touch up the gamma a little bit. So let's raise the gamma. So I'm gonna go to about here with the gamma, so which takes it to a pretty good point. So something like that. It all depends also on your image and how it was exposed. So let me see how that looks. Okay, so we brought our midtones a little bit to a better spot now. So that's looking good. The next thing I'm gonna do now is that obviously the color wheels here are affecting the image a little bit too broadly at this stage. So we want to be a little bit more, we want to add a little more contrast. It's just too broad right now. So I'm going to come here on my contrast, and I'm just going to slide this to really add contrast here. And I'm going to go to something like that for now. And now I'm going to go full screen. I'm going to show you, this is the before, this is the after. Now, something that you could see here right away is that the image did get a little bit darker. And that's pretty common, especially with grading, that you got to go back and then retouch other settings to offset what you just did. So it's iteration. So it's very common especially when you're working with extensive grades, etc. So what I'm going to do now is close to our contrast here, we also have a pivot. Think of a pivot as a balance for our contrast. You can raise it, or you can raise it, increase it, or decrease it. So I can come here, and you can see also, by the way, always have a look at your scopes, because that's how I'm operating right now. You can see that with the pivot, the contrast, right? We can offset it, basically, like balance it if we want to raise it and bring up more our midtones at the expense of the shadows. You can go that route, or you can do the opposite, where you prioritize your shadows. In this case, I'm going to increase a little bit because we did with our contrast, we did darken our image a little bit to something like that. You can even something like that. So you can see this is the before, this is the after, and now we can definitely see a pretty big difference. Now, the next thing, now that we've added a bit of contrast and the image now looks a little better, what we want to do is the normalization process is that if you look at the image, it's a little bit magenta. It's a little bit red. It's not very much balanced, and we want to correct for it, which is a pretty common task as well. If there's color casts, etc., you want to quickly correct for that. And how do we do that? Well, in this case, I am going to, since it's magenta, obviously you can come here to your tint slider and play it the opposite way. So in this case, add a little bit of green. So I'm going to add some green to the image, to something like that. And now you can see this is the before, this is the after. We definitely did take that magenta out, but I am going also here on the temperature, because I want to offset it a little more to something like that. And now you can see that our image maybe a little bit less here on the temperature. I'm basically trying to cool it down a little bit to around. And you can see this is a process where you very much so disable and enable your nodes. My hands are always on the Command D shortcut because you always want to make sure that you're not going too far or you're pushing too much. So for now, we'll keep it to something like that, which is pretty good. Here on my pivot, by the way, I'm going to do quick adjustment. And then on my gain, I'm going to take a tiny bit down here to something like that. So these are minor adjustments just to make sure that you can always go back and obviously play with your image as well and your clips. Great. So that's how you use your color wheels. Very, very basic, very, very basic way that we covered that. Now let's go to the next image where we are looking at this scale now. And let's now, this time around, work with curves, which between curves and primary color wheels, I do prefer the curves. And because of the flexibility they in fact do give you. And a lot of colorists, when it comes to especially balancing and the early stages, they do prefer curves because of that. It's much more flexible, and I'll show you how much more flexibility you have with this, which is pretty crazy. So what I'm going to do this time around, I am going to work with the viewer like that. So we're going to collapse our node editor and our, right? So we have just our main viewer here. And let's learn how the curves work very, very quickly. So before we do that, I'm going to, here you have this expand mode, and you can see that now you have a floating window to work with, which is pretty good because now you can make them a little bit bigger. Then obviously you want to resize it to a point where you obviously are not going over your image. So something like that works. Okay, perfect, right there. So now let's talk about how curves work. Curves are a little bit different. You can see that here this is representing an histogram, by the way, which is, the histogram reads a little bit different from the waveform. It reads basically from left to right. You can see that left is these are the shadows and these are the highlights. So if your image, right, so in my case here, the RGB channel, it's a little bit shifting towards the shadows. So that means that this image as a whole, it's a little bit dark. And you could see that represented in our histogram. If this, right, was a little bit on this side, more on this side, it would have been more overexposed, on the overexposed side. So before we start actually adjusting our image, let's talk about how this works. Now you have 2 points here. You can see that you have 1 point here and you have 1 point here. Our point here represents our shadows. Our point here represents our highlights. And then what can I do with it? Now, if I take my shadows here, okay, and on our vertical line here, this side here, right here, you are going to brighten your image. So if I take my shadows and I bring this up, you can see we're brightening our shadows. But now since this is here, if I take my highlights and I also take it this way, you're brightening your highlights. You see the commonality there? What's happening? So that's to take that, right, to make it brighter. Now, on this side, on the other hand, is the opposite. So if I take my highlights and I drag it down, now we're darkening our highlights. If I take my shadows and I take them this side, we're darkening our shadows. So think of it like this. So this is bright, dark, shadows, highlights. And anything in between, that's where I can create points and play with our midtones. So you take midtones up or down or left or right. Now, once again, this is very, very easy once you do it yourself and you start to practice and really start to gain a little bit more experience with it. So what we're going to do now, it's the same process we did earlier, which is first to normalize our image. So I'm going to start with the luminance, and then we are going to balance the colors as well. So before we do that, you can see here we have the YRGB. Once again, Y standing for luminance, RGB, red, green, blue. Now, we can see that with this chain icon right now, you can unlink them because right now everything is linked. So even the changes I make now, you're changing the saturation, right? So, and that's not what I want to do right now because I want to normalize first my image, right? So I want to take it looking at the scopes, at the waveform here, at the same process we did earlier with the color wheels, where we take, right, our shadows, we lower them a little bit, and we take our highlights, we take them to a good point, so we create a little bit more contrast. So that's what we want to do. So to do that, we need to, instead of, because we're affecting the luminance, having all of them selected, you can either unlink them, and then now you have the Y, or if they're linked, you just click on the Y, the luminance, and you're selecting that. Now, before we start affecting and adjusting the luminance, let's look at our scope here, our waveform monitor, and you can see that this is a very flat image. How do I know that? Well, because most of the image is concentrated in these lower midtones, except for maybe just this part here, which is our highlights in the window, as you can see over here, and over here, we could see you have the reflection of the light coming from outside into the wall. That's why that's peaking a little bit here. It's a little bit raised, right? So this is a pretty flat image, and we want to adjust that. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to start with the shadows, and we are going to take the shadows down a bit because this is too flat, and that's how you create contrast. Contrast is created, right? It's the opposite of having a flat image, by the way, which you are obviously lowering your shadows and heightening or raising your highlights. So I'm going to take my shadows here, this point on my curve, and we're going to start dragging it to the right because we want to lower our shadows. So obviously look at the scopes, look at your waveform in this case, and always make sure that you're not this, because obviously this will be loss of detail. So you want to never go, you're always in between 128 and 0 or 0 and 128. So something like that for me. So that's good. Now that we worked on our, you can see before and after. Now that we worked on our shadows, let's go with our highlights. So I'm going to grab my highlight here and drag that up. I'm going to drag it to, now this is the 90% point I was discussing in the beginning, which is generally speaking 90% white. You don't want to go over it. But since this part, which is represented here on my waveform, right, is a very bright, almost specular part of our image, it's okay to increase it a little more. So we can even go tiny bit higher, something like that. Now, you don't want to never go over 1023 because that's, I mean, look at that. That's, now it's pure white and it's unprofessional. So something like that, it's enough. And now you can see right away how much of a difference we made just by adjusting the shadows and our highlights in the curves. Now, why is the curve much more flexible? It's because now I want to adjust also my midtones, right? So we see that if it's deactivated, there we go. So you can see now that here, I decreased here, I took my shadows down, right? Between 128 and 0 to around here. And our image looks a little bit darker in the mids. So I can select my mids here. I can click. And now what I can do is raise my mids. That's affecting mainly my mids. to a point that I feel comfortable. This is before to something like that. And what's beautiful about the curves is this flexibility of how much in between the whole range in your midtones you can select very, very specific parts, right, of my luminance range in this case. While with the color wheels, which are great, you don't have as much flexibility as with the curves. And that's why I do prefer curves a little better, especially in this stage. And then you can see that now our image looks much better and much more normalized. And we also increased our mids, our lower mids, substantially here. And now the image looks at a much better spot. Great. Now that we did that, we can see that the next thing, the way to think about when you're grading an image is always what's the next step. So having a very concise scheme and plan to work with things. So in this case, we normalize our image. So what's the next step? Well, we want to balance it, right? So our image is not balanced. It feels a little bit on the red side, is not balanced. So how do I check for that? I can use my waveform. There's different tools, but I can use my waveforms here. I'm going to keep my waveform, and instead of Y, which is obviously showing my luminance, I'm going to go back to my RGB, and then I'm going to check this colorize here. And now we can see the whole representation, right, in our RGB channels here, RGB. And as I explained earlier, everything that is white in our trace means that there is equal intensity between the different channels. So ideally, we want to, for something like this specifically, where, I mean, a clock is pretty neutral, and these are pretty neutral colors, we can see that there is definitely a spike in our highlights in the reds. You can see that here, and in the mids as well. So in the midtones, you can see that it's a little bit higher. So we definitely want to adjust that. So what I can do now, and that's the beauty of the curves, I can go on my red channel here, and now I can start affecting my red curve here. So I'm going to start with my highlights here, and I am going to take them down a bit, and you can see, right, in the viewer, the difference that's making. Now, you can see that, right, like that. And I'm going to do the same here for my midtones here. So I'm going to take my midtones, I'm going to click here, and I'm going to drag it a little bit down, something like that, right? And now you could see that, look how much red that was in the image earlier. Look, and then now we took it out. However, now the image does look a little bit yellow. You could see that. There's a tiny bit of yellow in it. So let's adjust for that. Why is that happening? Well, because if you look at the waveform here, you can see that the blue here, we got to take the mids a little bit higher here, as well as the highlights are a little bit too low. So I'm going to now select my blue. And then what I'm going to do is take my curve here, my blue curve, and adjust for my mids. Take them up. So you want to, obviously, if you go too far, it's very easy to, you want to make sure that you're a pretty neutral spot. Something like that. And now you can see the before and after. I'm going to make a full screen. And now you can see how the balancing process works. Look at that. Now the image is much more balanced. Obviously, there is other ways in which you can always come back and adjust it and really fix things a little bit. So even this, you can take it down a bit here on the highlight. It just shows you how much control, right, you have in your curves. You can see that. So that's a little bit with curves. Now I can come here, go on the X, and that collapses it. And now we're back to our image here. And that's the curves. Now let's talk about the next topic, which is going to be, what is the difference, we're going to go back to our color wheels, between the color wheels here and another tool, which is the log wheels. To show you one of the main differences between the color wheel and the log wheel, we are going to, first of all, let's reduce this, let's change it here. Press Option F once again, takes you back. It reduces the size of our viewer here. And let's find a different clip. So I am going to go all the way to the end here to see over here. And we are going to look at effectively how the color wheels are different from the log wheels. And the difference, it's pretty striking. And once you understand what they do, you're going to find this tool to be very, very important, and you will use it for very specific uses as well. So let's start. Now here we can see that on our gradient here, that's visually represented on our waveform, and you can see this line going from 0 all the way to 1023, 1023, okay, in linear fashion. So let's see how by changing either the lift, gamma, and gain, that affects our graph, in our waveform here. So I'm going to go on the master wheel. I'm going to start with the gain. Now, if I go down here, the master wheel, and I start, right, either dragging up or down. So we're going to go down in this case. Look what happens as I drag my master wheel down. You can see here on the waveform that it's moving in a very linear way. But not just that. Now, look at the viewer here on our gradient. You can see that the highlights are affected the most. However, basically the whole image is getting affected. The highlights, the midtones, and the shadows as well. The more I keep dragging, you can see that everything is getting affected. And I can keep going and going. And it's a pretty strong, right? It's affecting the whole image uniformly. And let me reset that and show you how, by doing the same exact operation with the lift, which in this case affects mainly the shadows, right, our black point, it will affect also the midtones and the highlights as well. And you can see that if I drag that up, obviously the shadows here are affected more dramatically, but the midtones and the highlights are also affected. So the whole image is affected, as you could see. So let me quickly reset that, and I can show you that precisely with the hue, because that helps you also visualize it. Look how when I drag here the hue, do you see how that's affecting basically the whole image? Of course, more dramatically the highlights, but then also the midtones and the shadows are affected. So let me go back and let me show you another example with the lift. Right? So the shadows are affected the most, but then also the midtones and the highlights, you can see, are also affected. And that's it's done on purpose, of course, because that's how the color wheel works. That is a strong overlap between in this case, in the lift, between the shadows, midtones, and even highlights. And same happens with the gain, where obviously the strongest pull comes in the highlights, but also overlaps over the midtones and in the shadows as well. So basically, yes, you are affecting specific tonal ranges, but you're also affecting the whole image. The biggest difference with the log wheels is that their tonal range is much more defined. And let me visually show you that. So if I come here, right, and we're going to do the same operation with the highlight, look what happens with the highlight if I drag that down. So look what happens. You can see it here visually represented. We are mainly going to affect the highlights and a bit of the midtones, but we're not affecting the lower midtones and the shadows. Look as I keep clicking here. Do you see what's happening? Up to the point where basically this is becoming horizontal. And you can see it here as well. So let me reset it real quick. Now look at here in the viewer what's happening. Right? The highlights are being affected the most, and a tiny bit of the midtones also, because there is a tiny overlap between highlights and midtones, but it's not as strong as with the color wheels. So the log wheels have a much more defined tonal range, which is a really, really big difference. I'm going to do the same here with the shadows, and if I drag that up, you could see it in the waveform as well, that the same is happening, where the shadows are affected the most and with a tiny overlap into our midtones. But the higher midtones here and the highlights are not affected whatsoever. once again, that's because the tonal range is much more defined. And to show you that also, here visually, you can see if I change a hue, so I'm going with the blue, look how much here, if I go on my highlights, the highlights are affected, and a tiny portion of my higher midtones here, my high range, but the midtones, lower midtones, and the shadows are not affected, as you can see. And the same, I'm going to do the same operation with the shadows, where you'll see the shadows are going to be affected the most, and then just the low range here in our midtones. But it's not affecting the higher midtones and the highlights. So you can see a commonality there. You can see what the difference is. The difference is that the log wheels have a much more defined tonal range, which means that the log wheels affect more precisely. Either if you want to affect the shadows, it's going to be affecting the shadows in a much more dramatic way, leaving alone most of the midtones and the highlights. And same would happen with the midtones, same would happen with the highlights. On the other hand, with the log wheels, you're basically affecting the whole image. So that is a massive difference. And another thing to consider here is that we can see here we have a low range and a high range. What is the low range and what is a high range? So let me show you. So if I take, let me start with the shadows here. So if I drag my shadows up, you can see I go to something like that. Right. So the low range, as I was discussing earlier, there is a tiny overlap between the shadows and the lower midtones. So that overlap between the shadows and lower midtones, we call that low range. So now by dragging the low range either left or right, we can decide where to position our shadows. As you can see, we can go lower or we can go higher. That way we have much more control over the range that we're selecting, as you can see. So let me reset that. And that's because the low range, as I said, affects the area between the shadows and the midtones, so the low range. Same is true for the opposite. So I am going to take my highlights here, in this case down to something like that. And if I take my high range, in this case, I can either drag left to bring it down or drag it right to bring it up, as you can see. And the high range, on the other hand, it's quite the opposite. It's the range between the highlights and the higher midtones. So we call it high range, as you can see. And then you can obviously adjust either the high or low range to position either your highlights or shadows at your specified position, which can make a big difference. Great. So that now, I hope this gives you a good understanding what is the difference between the log and the color wheel. There is not really a better tool than the other, because like everything color grading, there is many ways you can do different things. They are just different tools and they're used for different operations. So it depends on what you're looking for. So if you want a much more defined and specific region that you want to affect, I highly suggest using the log wheels, because you have much more defined control over either the shadows, midtone, highlights. On the other hand, if you want to affect the image uniformly in a much more linear way, then the lift, gamma, and gain make much more sense. So that is the major difference there. Now, let's go to a different image. I am going to select image number 7, this one, which we have this beautiful sunset here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to press here Option F to make it a little bit bigger. And now let's adjust this image. We have a beautiful sky, but we can see that the foreground, it's a bit too dark. And that's because of the way that the image, the video was captured itself. So let's adjust that. So if I come here and we can see on our waveform here that I'm going to change this, by the way, to Y, and then I'm going to colorize. So we have our luminance range. Once again, Y stands for luminance, RGB is for red, green, and blue channels. So I'm going to keep it on my luminance. And let's raise now our gain, because we want to adjust our sky here. So if I come here on my gain and I go up, I can raise it to about here, remember, 90% white, so to the 896 range. Now, something is happening. It looks like the sky is blowing out, but if we look at our waveform here, we are still within range. So you might wonder, why is that happening? Because we're not clipping. We're not going over the 1023 range. We're well within, range. So why is that happening? Well, that is happening because we here in the waveform, we're able to see, right? We're able to see, even if I change into my RGB, we're able to see our red, green, and blue channels as a whole, but we're not able to individually select each channel and see what's happening within that channel. So to show that, I'm going to change this to parade, and now we can see each different channel, the red, green, and blue, and we can see that the red is clipping. That is why our sky is blowing out like that, because even though our green and blue are within range, the problem is that the red, it's not, and that could create a problem. So what I'm going to do now, I am going to go back on my waveform, back to that, and we're going to reset our gain once again. And how I'm going to do this, so if I obviously raise my gain, it's going to blow out the sky, at least the red channel in the sky. So instead, we are going to raise the gamma, our midtones. So by raising the gamma to something like that, now we can see that we bring back a lot of our foreground. But what's happening is that we're also sort of giving this washed out effect to our sky. But the thing with color grading is, or with correction and color grading, it's that first you want to go step by step, and then try to figure out how can you adjust each specific part. So what I'm going to do now is that maybe here the foreground, now we have too much, we brought back our detail, but now we can see it's almost like feels washed out. So what happens if I take my lift, which is my shadows basically, and take that down? Would that adjust and sort of create more contrast? Well, let's try it. So if I take my lift here and I drag that down, look what happens. All the shadows, as you can see, are very compressed. You can see this whole area here. You can see it in the waveform as well. It's really compressed. So even whatever I'm adjusting, there is a very strong pull, as you can see. And then if I go over, it's going to clip we're going to lose detail. So even though this does look better than what we just had, this is not the way to go. So I'm going to reset this. And instead, what I'm going to do, I am going to change once again to our trusty log wheels. Now, if I select my shadows, which we just discussed, have much more control over specific tonal ranges, we're able to define our selection better. So in this case, let's take the shadow and let's drag that down instead. Now look at the waveform as well, what is happening. You can see that now, if I drag that down, our image is extending and we have much more range here. Now what I can also do is I take my low range, just as we discussed, and by dragging either up or down, we can even further here add, can bring that up, can bring this down, further detail to my foreground here, which lives in my shadows. And that's how you can adjust, quickly correct for, that's basically the difference, understanding the difference between what a log wheel compared to just a regular color wheel can do. And understanding when to use which can make a difference without having to say, oh, which one is better than the other, because there's not such a thing. So I'm going to go back here to my color wheel, and here we can see we have a little bit of magenta tint. So I am just going to take the gamma and just go a little bit away from the magenta. So coming to the green a little bit. Now you want to stop at the point where you're pushing. You don't want to push too far, basically. So if I went to something like this, as you can see, that's too far. So you want to just push a tiny bit right before you see that you're going too far. So for instance, I'm going to go too far on purpose, something like that. And if I go full screen, you can see that the vegetation here and the greenery is a little bit too much. It does look better, and we do add more separation, but you don't want to go as far as that. So maybe something like that. And you can see that now we brought more the green into our greenery rather than having that magenta, which was the reflection of the sky. And then you can always come back here and really adjust things. And then if you're not happy also with that, you can always go back to your log wheels. And again, you can even increase the range here, right? The low range, you can go even lower, or you can go higher and then come down here. And then with the shadows, go even a tiny bit lower. And now you can see that I'm going to make it full screen and go before and after how much of the background we brought back. You can see that. I mean, we have much more detail. Once again, if you think that you went too far with how much green you add into the image, you can always go back and adjust, push and pull. It's always better to adjust, so go over the top. So try to go overboard every time and then bring it back. So don't be shy with it. Even if you think that, oh, I went too far, it's okay. And then you slowly can go back and try to figure out what is the real, okay? How much can I really push and pull? So that's the before, that's the after. Now, it does look better in our foreground. We definitely brought a lot more detail. But the issue here is that, look at the sky. I prefer this sky. The second sky looks kind of washed out, almost like we added an edit and just to, almost like a filter to adjust this sky, to make it, because we do want to keep this sort of, the color and just the contrast is spectacular, the view. So the next, I'm going to show you how to keep this image with this sky, because that's our next step in our tutorial. Once again, if you want to come back here and adjust even further, okay, your image here and add even more to the shadows, you can always go back. And as you can see, I can always even extend our range here to something like that. So make it even brighter, something like that. And then you can always come and drag down our shadow to something like that, even to further enhance and bring up more to our foreground. And in this case, you can see that we brought back a lot. And as you can see now, even more, and it's a huge difference. And even the vegetation here, as I was saying, looks much, much better. And that's all done in here. And then you can always come back and really finesse it even further, drag down even more, or even play with your low range here where you want it. So sort of like that. Even further to something like that, which I think something like that, it's good. And you can really play with it and decide how much. Now that we've brought back our foreground, because it was extremely underexposed earlier, we are still running into the issue where our sky, it now feels much more washed out. And you can see that by, obviously, if I press Command D here, I can come here and you can see the before and after. Even though we brought back our detail here in the foreground, you can see that the sky looks much, much richer here. And by comparing it, right, you can see that definitely it's very much, we lost that type of sky we had in our original footage. How do we bring that back? Well, I'm going to show you a technique. Now, I'm going to, by the way, press Option F to go back to our default layout. By the way, you can always go back to your default layout. Once again, coming here on Workspace and then reset UI layout, it takes you back to your original, in case you're wondering if you get lost or anything of that sort happens. I'm going to close, once again, the gallery. I'm going to keep this view. And we are going to learn now, how do we bring back the sky? Let's do that very, very easily. Now, I'm going to bring back this because I want to see a little more. And I'm going to show you one more time the huge difference between them. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we will learn in the next episodes, in the next lessons, such in lesson 3, how to work. Well, the second lesson, we will learn about shot matching. And the third lesson, we're going to learn what's called secondary grading. Secondary grading, which is a little bit different from primary grading, which is what we're doing right now. Primary grading affects the whole image entirely. Okay, So we're able to alter our whole image. With secondary grading, you are pinpointing and affecting specific areas of your image. That's what secondary grading does. Now, the tool that we're going to use for this specific exercise now to bring back our sky is a secondary tool, right? Used for secondary grading tool. And let's work with it. And this is something that's new to DaVinci Resolve 18, and it's a very, very, very powerful tool. When I come here on my effects, by the way, if this is the first time you see this, you can come here on this panel where you can see you can obviously click, right? And you have a few different options here, as you can see. But here on effects, you can see that we can bring that, right? Our effects here. And we can either scroll down and look at all the different effects that we have available to us, and there is a bunch. We can do a lot with these effects, with the Resolve effects. But what I'm going to do, my mouse. What I'm going to do now is to click here, and I am going to look for an effect called Depth Map. This effect right here. All you got to do is you click and drag, and then you can see that if I bring it here, there's this green plus sign, which is telling me that you can add it to this node. So I'm going to just release that. Now, Resolve takes a minute to process the information, and now we can see that this has happened. But we can also see that now our depth map is active here. You can see that there is a few parameters that we could change. Now, let's start talking about this and what does this mean. Now, as you can see, this is what the depth map has done here, has sort of applied a 3D map, has mapped our image, our environment, and created a 3D map. Okay, full on 3D map. We can see here you had our sky, here you had our mountains, and then in the foreground you had our trees and the greenery and all the grass, right, in the front. Now, not just that, but you can see that is different colors here. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, if you're familiar with how mattes work and how opacity and transparency works, you can also check my series on Fusion. But let me explain that very, very quickly. So the brighter colors, so anything that is white, it means that is full opacity. Anything that is gray, it is between full opacity and transparency, so it's in between. And then anything black, that means transparency. So basically what this means in layman's words is that we are now selecting whatever is the brightest in our image. So in this case, being the foreground for the most part, and then part of in the mid area here, and then the sky being not selected. However, we can also refine this a little better because we are able to do that through the depth map options here. And to do that, what I'm going to do now is to come here when it says resulting map adjustment. You can see there is this option here which says adjust map levels. I can check that. And now you can see that we have the ability here to change a few parameters. One of them being far limit, the second one being near limit, and then the gamma. Now I'm going to start with the near limit because I do want to affect my foreground. I want to make a clear selection of my foreground, and because that's the area I want to affect and I want to keep, and then I want the sky not to be selected. I want that to be full transparency. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to drag this down. And you can see that this can take a little bit of time to load, but you can see the difference that now this is making, as you can see there. So I'm going to go to a point where I'm going to type here. Better to type in this case. I'm going to say point, say 320, 325, something like that. Okay, and now we can see that we're selecting mainly here our foreground, as you could see. And then I can come here on my gamma, and I can also push that a little bit to here. I'm going to type maybe 1 point, say 40, something like that. And we can make even more. This is a little bit too much, so I'm going to say 1.040. So we can affect, that's pretty good. So you can see that now we're making a very, very much more detailed selection. And basically we're saying that all of this can be selected, right? This is full opacity, where is white, gray being in not full opacity, it's in between, and then black being, as I said, transparency. So now what that happens is that if I come here on my depth map preview, you're going to see that our effect is now applied. I'm going to click on it, let it process, and now you can see that we brought back, I'm going to make it a little bigger so you can see a little better here by pressing Option F, and you can see that now we brought back our beautiful sky that we loved from the original clip that we had. So if I come here and I press Command D, you can see that look at the difference in the sky. Nothing is changing. As you could see, the sky is the same. However, if you look at our greenery here and the front, the grass where the trees are, look how much we brought back. As you could see, we even, remember, went to our color wheels and pushed that gamma towards green. As you could see here, it's a little bit towards this side because we want to get rid of that magenta and bring in a little bit of green back into our image. And you could see that how much that made of a difference that made. And also another quick tip is that if you press Shift D, you can also bypass the entire node pipeline. So you have the Command D, which can obviously affect the single node. Okay, I'm gonna close the effects here, and so Command D affects a single node, but if you press Shift D, you can see here it also says bypassed. If you had a number of nodes, it would bypass the entire node tree. Now another thing here on clip, you can see, say you stuck up a lot of nodes here on clip, you can always come here and make it smaller or bigger. It's here. You have that available, and you can move around here, your node editor. And that's the difference that makes. And you could see that we did that very, very easily. And that's one of the tools that you could use. See, it was very effective in this exercise because we're able to do a mix of a few different tools. We used our color wheels, right, to, sort of normalize our image and bring the gamma up, right? But then we didn't use a lift because we were crashing our blacks. Instead, what we did is we went back to our shadows, and then we took our shadows down and also with the low range as well. So it was a combination of both. And then finally, we were able to go back to our color wheels here, bring back the green inside of our trees in the front, in the foreground here. And finally, we used a depth map, which is a secondary grading tool, to keep the same sky. So not because we had a very washed out sky after we performed all these different corrections, and bring the sky back, but keeping all of our changes intact. And that's the power of combining multiple tools within your grade, which is very powerful. Now the quick tip here is that usually it's very good to start playing with the luminance range and hues and sort of ballpark with your color wheels, and then if you want more refined adjustments, sort of acting like a secondary tool in a way, it's to come here to your color wheels and really specify or sort of go very in depth with which tonal range you want to affect, because shadows, midtone, and highlights, they have a very definite and they're very precise with the corrections that you're performing. Now, another quick tip is that these tools are very effective, especially the log wheels are very, very effective when you're working with overexposed and underexposed footage, as you can see here, as we did here, because you're able to really retain retain that detail and really make those micro adjustments and really fix and bring back, either if you're clipping your highlights or if you lost detail and your footage is overly underexposed. So that's about that with the lesson number 1, introduction to the color page inside of Resolve 18. And in the next lesson, we are going to learn another crucial and important step, which is shot matching. How do we match shots? Which is very, very important. And then on the third lesson, we will learn more about secondary grading. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and write a comment. Let me know if there is any questions or anything that you felt that you maybe didn't understand, or if you have any questions, just let me know, really, and I'll try to answer all the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the second episode.